Welcome to Holding the Line, a podcast about cops, courts, and crime. I'm LELDF President Jason Johnson, joined as usual by Sean Kennedy, our Director of Policy at the Law Enforcement Legal Defense Fund. So, Sean, you had Professor Peter Moskos of John Jay College on an interview we're going to play on this episode, actually. And man, you guys are nerds.
I don't know how many lockers Peter got shoved into, but I've seen the inside of a few.
Well, I mean, he was a Baltimore cop for a little while. It's probably like he had to do like anti-nerd training where nobody would understand what he was talking about in East Baltimore. But Peter, Harvard-educated guy, academic, decides even after he was in academia, hey, I think I'll go be a Baltimore City cop for a year and see what that's like, which is unique. Not many of these folks in academia that study policing, no matter what perspective they're coming from, actually has walked in the shoes of a bona fide big city cop in America.
Absolutely. And what's important about, sort of lived experiences, that phrase I hate so much, but he actually did the job. So many of these people are like anthropologists and they just wander around tagged along with cops, but they don't actually have to do the work. They just get to like sit in the back of the squad car. They don't have to go home and like live on the paycheck and, all these other things that are the real nitty gritty of all this. And Peter did do it. And then he went back into academia. And now he has a perspective that few in academia have. There's a few others, but almost every one of them came from policing to that, not academia to policing and then back. But Peter has a great book out called Back from the Brink about the NYPD's astounding success in the 90s, tackling violent crime. And we talk about a lot of different things that I think, if you're interested in the state of policing and what actually works in crime, Peter is not a conservative. Peter is a liberal, to say the least, but he's, reasonable on crime, and he looks at it from a really practical point of view, which is refreshing in academia. We're so glad to have Peter Moskos join us. Peter has the strange, refreshing perspective of being both Harvard-educated, an academic, and a former cop. Peter, thank you for joining us. And tell us a little bit about yourself and how you went from being an academic to being a cop to being an academic again.
I did my PhD research. Originally, I was just going to observe police, and Baltimore City said I could until I got there, and then they said I couldn't, and I think they just had mercy on me and said, well, why don't you want to become a cop for real? And I said, well, who's going to hire me knowing that I'm going to quit after a year, though I stayed a bit longer, but I'm going to quit and write a book about it. And the acting commissioner at the time said, if you can get hired, we'll hire you. Harvard was not very happy with that, by the way. But I've, in effect, I mean, not only have I banked my career on my 20 months in Baltimore, but, it gave me a perspective. I joke, cops do 20 and out, but mine were months and not years. But still, Eastern District of Baltimore is you learn quick there. People may know it as where The Wire was filmed. It's a rough area. And I moved to New York, and I've been a professor for 20 years now, and teaching both New York City undergrads and also NYPD officers in a master's program. So it's a nice combination.
One of the things, we just had Laura Huey on the podcast, and Laura's a professor at the University of Western Ontario. What's interesting is her background is not yours in the sense that you were a law enforcement officer, but you also have a unique background. But there's a lot of people in academia who study policing, but have never walked a mile in the shoe of cops, let alone you were talking about observing cops. Some of them have never even done that. And they write extensively about policing.
Laura's great, by the way. We were just swapping pictures of our garden today. But she, talks to cops, and she does great work. By and large, though, I mean, I look at the people I respect in academia, and it's not a huge list. It's probably about a dozen or so. And the vast majority of them do have practitioner background. Those who don't, who are good, and there are many who are not, but those who are good simply do quantitative work and look at, data and numbers, and so they can do good work on that. I'm thinking of someone like Eric Pisa. He does good stuff. And Anthony Braga, he was never was he a guy? I don't think he has a police background, but they're great. But at some point, it's just understanding this does not only apply to policing. I wish it applies to everything in the social sciences. But how can you possibly do research and write things about people you don't understand, that you don't know, that you haven't spoken to? And in theory, you shouldn't have to be a cop, but maybe it does to a certain extent. Give you a deeper understanding. It certainly helps my research because cops will talk to me because they know that I was one, and so there's an assumption that I don't have my head up my ass right from the beginning, and hopefully I prove that assumption works in my favor. But yeah, it is interesting. It was so long ago, but I'm also I'm still in touch with people I worked with 26 years ago in Baltimore, and I feel closer to them in many ways than most of the professors I've been working with since then.
You've written a little bit about this, actually a lot of bit about this, but it's something I think is so fascinating when you're talking about the idea of doing quantitative research. But one of the big fundamental problems is what is it about this kind of push? I almost see it's in the media too, and maybe it's a human failing, but it's the idea of creating singular causality. When we talk about crime and policing, both failures and success, there's always this notion of like, this is the one reason why X is happening. X causes Y, causes Z. What is it about academia, and at least in the context of crime and policing, that has gotten us sort of reduced to singular causality? Because when I read so many of these academic papers about policing, they try to isolate a variable, but they're really not fully taking into account on either side all of the different moving parts.
Um, yeah, but there's sort of a flip side to that coin, which is academics are so leery to say there's any causality ever, and they talk about correlation doesn't equal causality, which is statistically true, but it's a clue. And then you have to put on your thinking cap and figure out if there is some causal action there, because I mean, in the real world, you're not going to have the blind randomized control experiment like a medical trial that can prove causality. But it's at some point you see the same patterns again and again. Um, but I think a lot. I mean, I'm anti-theory. I mean, my background, my education was sociology. And I don't teach in a sociology department. I'm much more interested simply in how to make policing better and how to reduce crime and violence and how to save lives through policing. I don't think police are the only way you can do that, but they're certainly part of the equation. And that's where I start attacking the advocacy. You have to have some. Uh, Look, everyone's got their biases, but you have to have a certain amount of objectivity. I mean, I criticize police all the time, which people who criticize me don't seem to notice because those critics usually come from more the ACAB crowd and the defund movement. But I'm lucky to be at John Jay College in a department that has a lot of diversity in every way, and so I have a happy home there. But yeah, I think you get a lot of singular causality because you write a dissertation and then sort of everything for the next 10 years of your career has to sort of follow that pattern. So you're trying to prove whatever your point was to sort of hammer that home again and again. I've been able to do my research a bit more broadly. My first book was a revision of my dissertation on policing in Baltimore, but I wrote a book about crime and punishment. I wrote a book that was originally my father's book on Greek Americans. Um, and now I have an oral history on the New York City crime drop in the 90s, which is kind of why I got into the field, going back to my Harvard days, because I started grad school in 1995, and murders were plummeting in New York City. And all the sociologists and criminologists were basically saying that it wasn't happening. It couldn't happen. It was impossible because, as they keep telling us, you have to address root causes and fix society. And it turns out you don't. Not that you shouldn't, but you don't have to. And you can reduce violence by just addressing violence. And that is a realization that is, I thought the field would change to reflect reality, and it hasn't.
Well, I mean, one thing I will tell you about I want to talk more about the New York City crime drop because I'm fascinated by it and what you think Bratton's role in it was, or Giuliani, and then other things about NYPD culture. But one of the fascinating things about violence is I did an analysis. Now, again, I'm not saying this is a perfect statistical analysis to the idea of singular causality or limited quantitative measures, but I took an analysis and took the highest point year, which I believe was 1991 or 1993, depending on which one you count, which was about 2,100, a little over 2,000 homicides in a year in New York City. And New York City at the time had about 7.5 million people. At the time, if that had stayed static at 2,100 homicides, by 2018, which is the low year in the history of New York City, which were under 300 homicides in a city of now 8 million people, the homicide delta was 40,000 between each year of the actual homicide tally and the expected homicide tally at a 1991 level. The idea that there are 41,000 people alive today that wouldn't have been otherwise, I don't know how you can argue with that. I mean, I'm not arguing for Bukalele, but at the same time, that's an amazing, miraculous moment.
We can, you can quibble about numbers a bit because I don't think policing is the only answer. I mean, look, the crack epidemic receded. But New York we could have a murder rate like Chicago today. What happened in New York was unique. People say, well, crime went down everywhere. Well, first of all, no, it didn't. It did go down most places. It didn't go down in Baltimore, for instance. But it happened first in New York, it happened fastest in New York, and it happened longest in New York. Clearly something special was happening in New York City. And there's just, at least, so many people are they're willing to believe any theory other than policing. And that's sort of the ideological bias. But it's it's kind of depressing actually, starting in 2015, but really in 2020, to go from, I'm not saying I played a major role in it, but whenever small role I played in the field, and I like to think I made, very indirectly policing a little bit better. And then to have, 15, 20 years after I start to have to argue that actually policing is good. I mean, it was like, this is where we're at now, is don't abolish police. And that's unfortunate. I think the pendulum's, has swung back a little bit towards sanity, but it was a crazy 10 years, and policing hasn't recovered. You see that in recruitment issues and so on, and funding issues still. But recent trends have been pretty good. So, so my point being, I don't know if New York City had bad leadership all these years, we'd probably have fewer than 2,000 murders, but we could have 1,000.
Mm-hmm.
Either way, we're talking Yankee Stadium filled with people who are alive today who otherwise would have been killed. And that doesn't count, all the people who are shot and lived and traumatized, and the family. I mean, the way that trauma spreads through peer groups and intergenerationally, you prevent a murder you don't have the counterfactual world, so you can never document. Although some people have tried to show the cost of a murder. It's huge, just financially.
It's $1 million, it's supposedly, according to a number of academics.
Yeah. And that doesn't count all sort of the indirect trauma and so on. And this year, we'll see. But now, probably under 300 murders. That's amazing for an American city of more than 8 million people.
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to talk about, because you wrote a book, as you said, called Back from the Brink, and it's about this story. And I think it's a really compelling narrative. And what I think is most interesting is I can do the data. I could do the analysis and say, okay, well, this is what it is. It's 40,000 people, and there's the causality, and here's what Bill Bratton said in the New York Daily News that week or whatever. But you talked to a lot of cops about what actually went on behind the scenes. Can you give us a quick sort of summary about what people were doing to make it happen? Because Bill Bratton and Giuliani and other people obviously both have taken credit and may have, steered the ship, but they didn't, man the torpedoes. What was going on down at the ground level that made that such a success?
Yeah, going after repeat violent offenders. That's, the single biggest thing. But when I went into this, and the interviews happened over a period of more than 10 years, so I spoke to a lot of people, including Bratton, about what happened. And I understood sort of the philosophy behind it. And, I understood the work from a patrol cop of what you can do and what you can't do. But I still did not understand. So you have this thing called CompStat. Okay. They set that up, Jack Maple and Lou Anemone, and Bratton supported it. I don't give Giuliani much credit. He did hire Bratton, but remember, he fired Bratton very quickly. Those are two big egos, and one worked for the other. So Bratton resigned. Giuliani also did not give cops a raise for 3 years, zeros for heroes, as it was known. But it's that middle ground. How do weekly meetings stop people from shooting each other on the street? That is the question I was trying to answer. And it's about accountability. It didn't have to necessarily be CompStat, though that was what they used and it worked very well. The the story I give is, so Jack Maple was Bratton's right-hand man. And when he came in, and he was a transit cop lieutenant before that, so, he wasn't really trusted, or how did this guy suddenly become basically the number 2 guy in the police department? But he asked NYPD chiefs, how many people were shot last year in New York City? And nobody knew. How could the NYPD not know how many people were shot in New York City? Because they weren't focused on crime. I mean, they had the data, the shootings were recorded, but no one was paying attention to them. No one was compiling them. And if you start from such a low bar of, why don't we figure out where crime is happening and when? And then why don't we put cops where the crime is happening? It was a mission statement. We're going to care about crime. Before that, the NYPD cared about corruption. They cared about preventing riots, particularly race riots. They cared about scandal. But they weren't focused on crime. Crime goes up, crime goes down. Look, the academics say it's not our business. So, we sort of passed the buck. And for Bratton to come in and say, we're going to reduce violent crime 15% in the first year, there was nothing in it for him to do that. No police commissioner or chief had ever done that before. Say, it's on me. The buck stops here. That was a bold move on his part. But they were so confident that they could do this, partly because they had experience in the transit police department a few years prior. They needed the political support. Giuliani did give them that. And then they mapped the crime. Jack Maple loved maps. He didn't love computers or tech, but he loved maps. And he noticed that nobody was working on weekends. Nobody was, the specialized units were all working Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. But criminals were working 24/7. So, he made people work nights and weekends. And in a way, that's easy because he just did it. But I mean, if you're it's a huge deal to change work schedules and so on. A lot of the institutional change, it's just bureaucratic stuff. If you have this huge organization and if you weren't on board, you were, kind of you weren't forced to retire, but the way it works is you can get demoted down to civil service rank. So if you're a chief and you're not on board, they're going to resign before you're demoted for pension reasons. And they got their team, and they just said, we're going to talk about it every week. And we're going to, if you make an arrest, clearance. That was the other thing that mattered before. You make 3 or 4 robbery arrests for every 10 robberies, you're good. But no one asked, are we stopping the robberies? They went after instead of just arresting a car thief, let's see where he's taking the car. Let's take down the whole operation. Let's go to the chop shop. Sort of pulling on all the threads. And the speed at which it started working was, it was almost instantaneous, although August 1994 was the real sort of tipping point, and murders just started plummeting. It's also worth pointing out, just for the naysayers, and I don't think there are too many naysayers listening right now, but poverty did not go down in New York. Giuliani cut social spending. Now, you can argue, whether his cuts were right or wrong is sort of a political matter, but it didn't matter in terms of fighting crime. And they, Bratton was on the cover of Time magazine, which is sort of why he got fired. But it wasn't a secret. And the recipe was, they had a dog and pony show. People came in, they won awards. And they said, let's just focus on crime. We're police officers. Let's be cops again. And so other departments were able to follow that pattern as well, some with more or less success. But the genesis really was with the NYPD, but before that with the New York City Transit Police.
So not to be the skunk in the garden party, but Bill Bratton's next job was at the Los Angeles Police Department, or one of his next jobs, which at the time was under a consent decree. And what happened was, after Bratton left, it is later revealed through an LA Times investigation, and then becomes a city audit and goes on for years after that, that they were cooking the books, particularly on aggravated assault. Something that has now basically become part of this DC police scandal about downgrading crimes. So do you see a downside to the pressure about numbers that CompStat unleashed?
Well, look, they were very focused on don't cook the books. The numbers in New York were honest at the time. But if you're going to judge people by numbers, of course, people want the numbers to be favorable. It constantly has to be, you need oversight. It has to be stressed time and time again. And, as an academic, I don't like looking at assault numbers because most assaults aren't reported. The difference between simple and aggravated, or misdemeanor and felony, is somewhat arbitrary. You don't have to be even trying to cook the books to categorize one or the other. I like murders. I like shootings. In terms of data, those numbers are reliable. You can compare them city to city, and other crime almost always correlates with that. If I see a large decrease in assaults and no decrease in shootings and murders, I'm very suspicious. I don't know Los Angeles that well. I do know murders plummeted under Bratton again, so maybe they were,
To your point, what they were doing was under the old UCR, I don't want to go too depth for our listeners who are lay crime stats people, but under the old crime system until pre-2020 was called Uniform Crime Reporting System, SRS, Summary Reporting System. And that involved violent crime and property crime split into two. And violent crime consisted of murder, rape, robbery, aggravated assault. And to your point, aggravated assault between assault and simple assault is a violent crime in the 4 category, and simple assault is not even on the ledger. And so by reducing aggravated assault, which in general context constitutes between a third and a quarter of all violent crime, murder, by the way, constitutes less than 5% even in the largest jurisdictions. You can have an outsized influence on totals and percentages. So what they were doing was taking a third, or it turned out it was a 15% decline over the 10-year period. And they were just basically reducing some share of ag assaults down to simple assaults. And then they came off the total counts and it didn't matter that the same number of crimes were happening, or there were fewer, but it was reducing the rate of, or increasing the rate of decrease. It's like shaving points. Sometimes it doesn't affect the outcome of the game, but somebody wins.
Well, it's worse than shaving points because once you start doing it, you have to keep doing it, or else you're going to get a artificial crime increase that doesn't reflect reality once it's reported correctly again.
And that just happened in Columbus a couple years ago.
If you're a precinct commander,
what happened in Columbus.
Yeah, there's you're going to be out of there in a couple years, so you only have to keep up the stat cooking business until you're out of there, and then it's not in your hands. There's a flip side to that. There's a neighborhood in New York City, Corona in Queens, and I noticed a couple years ago that compared to that, there were as many aggravated assaults as the worst years, 1990, 91. I said that can't be. Meanwhile, shootings compared to that time period were down 80-90%. I said something is wrong here. Like there's no way. I mean, I don't believe my lying eyes. I go there. It's not that. And I asked a cop who had some insight in it. I said, what the hell is going on? And he said, well, body cameras. I said, what do you mean? How do body cameras increase assaults? He said, because in the old days, you have a bar fight and you just tell them to go home. Or you arrest them for disorderly conduct. And now with body cameras, you have to, the reporting accuracy is much greater. And so he said, these assaults were always happening. The numbers now are correct. It's just before, 20 years ago, cops weren't worried about recording aggravated assaults.
That's a great point, because that's something we just wrote about in the Wall Street Journal. Jason wrote about regarding the ICE shootings that had happened in the last month or so, that either way, whatever actually happened, body cameras would have answered the question, or at least helped to answer the question, maybe not fully. So what is your take on body cameras? Because one of the most interesting things, as you were saying 10 years ago, or the last 10 years, there was a lot of resistance in law enforcement agencies to body cameras. So what is your take on what the sort of legacy so far is?
I will say I'm happy I didn't have to wear one, but not because I was covering stuff up. But I was back in Baltimore a couple of years ago and did a ride along with the guy, and he's like, body camera on. I was like, oh, now we can't crack jokes. There was a lot more joke cracking and making fun and, I don't know, good times. Nobody was hurt, but there was a greater discretion for better. I mean, I'm pro discretion, but, it can be misused too. I mean, the story of them is fascinating because, yes, they were imposed on cops. Cops were kicking and screaming. And people who wanted body cams thought this will reveal the dark underbelly of policing, and then it turned out that cops were basically telling the truth the vast majority of the time. And you know what? If they're not, great, then body cams can catch that too. And now the same people, or maybe, well, yes, the same people, and certainly the same causes who were pushing body cams want to limit them because, it's a lot easier to convict somebody when they're on body cam doing exactly what the statement of probable cause says they were doing. And now cops are like, oh, I can't imagine policing without them. Every bit of technology cops resist and usually end up embracing, from the walkie-talkie to body armor. Yes, cops are very resistant to change. And then often not always, but often that technology ends up being good for cops.
So you write a lot about good policing. It's not a question of whether or not policing is good, though you think obviously you're pro police, is that there is bad policing and there's good policing. So what would you judge a police department by? What are the qualities of a good police department? And on the flip side, what are the qualities of a bad police department? How should we judge whether or not an agency is doing a good or bad job?
To some extent, I simply want to I think good policing is effective policing. Are police reducing crime and disorder? Is the public less afraid of criminals, and hopefully not afraid of cops either, at least, non-criminals I'm talking about. It's very hard to measure public fear, so it usually isn't measured, but you can do it. But if people feel safer, they're willing to cut cops a lot of slack. And there is a problem that there are bad cops out there. And that is on police departments to identify them and either retrain them or get rid of them. And some police departments do that better or worse. A bad police department is less transparent, is hiding stuff, is not releasing, not answering questions. A bad police department feels under siege. Sometimes they can be, by the way, which is, another issue. A good, as a researcher, if I go to a police department and say, hey, can I have unlimited access? Most American police departments will still say no or put conditions. I have to know somebody. I've done research in England and I've done research in the Netherlands, and both places welcome me with open arms and just said, yeah, do whatever you want. I found that very refreshing because they had nothing to hide, and I guess they also figured I wasn't out to get them. I don't know, but there was nothing to get necessarily. Other countries don't have the ideological divide that we do, where conservatives are pro-cop and, liberals, I mean, I'm oversimplifying, of course, and liberals are anti-cop. But I put myself in as a pro-policing liberal because I think you can't have a fair society if you don't have good policing. I do like to say it's a subtle distinction, but I like to emphasize it. I'm not necessarily pro-police. I'm pro-policing. I'm pro-police when they're good. I'm anti-police when they're bad. But policing as a verb, we need it. We want it. And it is, rule of law is the basis of civilization. When that breaks down, you can't have nice things.
So in that sense, what does the left get wrong about policing? What is it that there's a few, I would say, as you could say, pro-policing public intellectual liberals like yourself, Thomas Edsel, Matt Iglesias. I haven't checked in on Ezra Klein lately, but those kind of like YIMBY, whatnot, intellectuals. But what is the general left? Because as you mentioned, post-Floyd, there was this, for want of a better term, mass hysteria that policing needed not necessarily be abolished, but defunded, or what they would call reform, but they really meant like tearing it down or doing a lot of sort of very radical things to it. What is the left getting wrong about policing today?
I do think, as you sort of did it, I think it's important to distinguish between, I identify politically as a liberal. The Democratic Party is especially in New York, is being taken over, is being hijacked by the progressive far left wing. They hate liberals, by the way, just, so that's an important distinction to make. If you want to make, what the far left gets wrong is simply that policing they say policing is bad and and is in fact, the cause of crime. I mean, it gets really crazy and extreme at some level, revolutionary ideas. And of course, they would just implement their own brutal police department, or you have mob rule. I just listened to a podcast about CHOP in Seattle, and yeah, they ended up shooting and killing an unarmed black teenager. Exactly what the whole movement in theory was supposed to stop. The irony is deep, and and lives were lost. The old left, Bill Clinton passed the 1994 crime bill. The Black Congressional Caucus supported tougher drug laws for better or for worse. We didn't used to have that distinction. Everyone understood that we need police. The question was how to do it. And, to reformers, I say this. I mean, if you want to make policing better, I want reform to be good. Yeah, reform is often a cover for abolish policing or drastically reduce it. Good policing scares that abolition crowd because, I mean, yeah, that good policing to them is worse than bad policing because they have an agenda and they're trying to get there by any means possible. If you don't want to make police better, you should not have a seat at the table of police reform. If you're well-intentioned in the sense that, even if mistaken, and we're all mistaken sometimes, but if your goal is to improve policing, then yes, have a big tent. It's something Bratton, by the way, did in LA, is try and get his opponents to be part of his team. And he told me I'd much prefer to have people inside my tent than standing outside pissing on it. So, you have to welcome to a certain extent what you might see as the opposition, but the opposition has to also be well-intentioned and say, yes, it is our goal. I mean, look, if we could reduce police-involved shootings without any impact on crime, great. Who's against that? If there's, that would be true reform. But as, I forget the term you used, hysteria, I believe. I would also call it a moral panic, and a more academic term, but this, you take a little grain of reality and then just, even today, I think people think cops shoot and kill so many more people than reality reflects.
And speaking of mugged by reality and tying it to not Bratton, is a little after Bratton, but LAPD. So after, in the early 2010s, they brought in a civilian oversight board for police discipline. And the idea was that the internal police IA system, disciplinary system with, commanders and chiefs making decisions about whether or not line cops got disciplined for misconduct was too buddy-buddy. So they bring it in. The misconduct complaint substantiation rate drops. The number of disciplinary actions taken against officers drops. The reason was the people who are on the inside were holding the cops to higher standards. That you did something wrong, you're a stain on the department, you're a stain on us, we have to hold you to account. Whether or not that's to take your badge or not is not it, but you need to know that you're getting cashayed or whatever you want to call it. And the civilians were like, I don't know what to make of this incident, so nothing.
Yeah, I've never been there. It looks like a rough job. You get that sometimes from civilian oversight commissions, and the flip side is you get people who are fishing for just to screw cops any way they can. And you see that more in Chicago, to some extent, New York. I do want some outside people because, yeah, it depends on the department and it all depends on leadership, but I don't know how you ensure good leadership. So you have to have a system that can also be stable and effective when the leadership isn't so good. I think we in a way focus too much on big city police departments that tend to do things better. There are a lot of sheriff departments and a lot of small town police departments that no one's really looking at. And I mean, it's just because people know the name, and I don't mean to pick on them in particular, though I kind of do. But Ferguson, Missouri, back in the day, it's like, yeah, they were doing some bad stuff, and which is ironic because the actual controversy was not one of those things. But then we found all these other things that were going on about how
smoke. Where there's smoke, there's fire. It was that the shooting of Michael Brown was sort of blown out of proportion, but it didn't mean that the rest of the Ferguson department didn't have problems.
Yeah, as soon as you pulled back the curtain, you were like, oh my God, they're doing this, and the whole thing's funded through fines and so on. And I don't know how we bring attention to that. If you're concerned about police-involved shootings, let's look at the departments that shoot a lot of people because they're out there. And they're almost all medium-sized cities west of the Mississippi, often with a low percentage of black population. But they're shooting people at rates 10 times New York City. So we're New York City has its problems, as does the NYPD, but arguably it is one of, if not the best, large police department in America. How much juice can you get from that squeeze? You set up another oversight commission. That's not. I don't think police-involved shootings in New York could get much lower, honestly, than they are now. Cops. There used to be a police-involved shooting. I mean, now we're going back decades, but there used to be one almost every day in New York City, and now it's 10 a year or something.
Well, Peter, I want to end on a final note and take you back to your roots, to Baltimore. Baltimore has recorded a historic low. It's roughly, at the time of this podcast, about 60 homicides for the year. Baltimore at this pace is going to, for the first time in maybe 100 years, see fewer than 100 homicides. What is going on with Baltimore?
Well, they haven't solved poverty, bad education, racism, all those things haven't changed much. What I think has happened is they replaced a corrupt and incompetent prosecutor with a good prosecutor who I'm just going to give him the benefit of the doubt and say he's not corrupt, but he's effective. Often when there's a Kim Foxx in Chicago or something, that does get attention, but not enough attention is played to the prosecutor. It's more important than I realized, and I think more important than a lot of other people realize. So that's part of the equation. The other part is they had good police leadership, and that took a while. A friend of mine, Tony Barksdale, who passed away not that long ago, became the mayor's crime man, and he was a protege of Jack Maple and understood what is going on. And I think the mayor matured a lot. He came in very young, and I think he's gotten better. Do the community programs work? Let me just say they've been going on for 20 years. So have they changed and gotten better? Maybe. I don't want to discount them, but I am a little bit dismissive of that. At some point, maybe it can hurt. If you have people that go into visit a hospital and immediately to try and prevent retaliation after a shooting victim shows up, like that kind of stuff, hopefully it can hurt. But man, there's a lot of corruption in those programs as well. But it just seems that suddenly we have, good policing and good prosecution. And yeah, the drop has been dramatic. I don't have all the answers to Baltimore, quite frankly. I'm not there anymore. But I still feel attached to the city, so I'm thrilled to see that happen. It is the hard work of men and women in various capacities that are doing it. It doesn't just happen. It's very easy to say, well, now they're, after it happens, well, now their murder rate's more like other cities. Yeah. Great. I mean, it still could be even lower, but you learn from success rather than just saying, oh, well, no, it's not because we got rid of lead and gasoline 50 years ago. It's not because of legalized abortion. It's because of...
By the way, let me stop that for our listeners. Peter is referring to a number of academic Freakonomics arguments about the idea that leaded gasoline contributed to people's lower IQs, which caused them to commit crime, or that we aborted our way out of the crime problem. So just to give you a context of Peter's obscure reference, those are academic theories that are somewhat comical. But
I hear that a lot still, even among non-academics. The funny thing is even the proponents of the lead theory say, there are a couple different studies. Maybe it was 10 to 15% of the reduction. Though what was interesting about the reduction is it wasn't cohort-based. When crime went down in New York, violence stopped among young people and old people. So lagged effect studies are just tough because in the real world, so much else happens. But you just see that, you see people say, we're going to do this new strategy. And then it works and people say, well, it must be something else. I don't know. You can never prove anything for sure. But again, that correlation is a clue, and then you got to look into it and see what's going on. But yeah, Baltimore does have specific changes that. What I'd like to know then is, what's that next step? I don't know exactly. What did Tony Barksdale do to policing? But I can guess because it's not rocket science. It's hard work, but you focus on the repeat violent offenders. There's so few people that are causing so much of the problem, and you get them and you take them out through incarceration, and you do that to just this is not mass incarceration. It's targeted incarceration. And you take out, in a city like Baltimore, if you can lock up 10 to 20 shooters, and maybe that deters another 10 to 20. That's your reduction right there.
Yeah, it's striking. Thank you, Peter, for joining us. Um, your insights are always valuable. And one of the most refreshing things about Peter is not a sort of a monolith in that. And I would recommend everybody, if you are on the Twitter X, whatever they're calling it these days, follow Peter's very amusing and informative X account at Peter Moskos. And again, Peter, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for the conversation. As you can tell, I love talking about this stuff.
This was a really great interview. And if you want to catch up on all the other episodes, please check us out on your podcast apps and give us a 5-star review. Until next time, this is Holding the Line, a podcast about cops, courts, and crime.